Um, Architecture has a political responsibility if it's working in the public realm, without question. If we're impacting people's lives, we have to be careful and conscious of who we're impacting, what we're doing to their existence, how we're contributing or detracting, how we're imposing or making things accessible. So while architecture may not necessarily be a mouthpiece of political regime, it may not be an act of politics, it is by definition, it does have meaning to the public, and it must take its role seriously in terms of how it impacts and what it's trying to do. The way we work with our clients, whether they're public or private, is to interrogate their programs very deeply and to try to understand how the program can contribute to the public realm in ways that sometimes were not thought of by the client originally. In the case of Lincoln Center, which is one of our major projects in New York City, what we did there is we turned the campus inside out. It was a fortress. And it was foreboding. It was built on a plinth with a solid base around it, and it didn't reflect the times, where the city is much more democratic, open, accessible. So the way we did that primarily was through the use of glass, but also through bringing media to the streets, letting the things that were happening inside be brought outside, so that just passersby could be witness to some performance and to some of the content that's happening in Lincoln Center. But on top of that, we convinced Lincoln Center to make spaces that were in fact open to everyone to use in ways that had nothing to do with what was going on at Lincoln Center. Lincoln Center is positioned by two schools, a junior high school and a high school for the performing arts. And in the past, those students had always been shunted out of Lincoln Center. There were security guards that didn't even let them go up the stairs. And we said to them, these are your future patrons, this is your city, this is the youth of New York City. Why would you be keeping them out? And we convinced Lincoln Center to let us add park space that was open to the public and encouraged people of different social strata, economic means, and motivations to congregate in Lincoln Center. And of course, they've had no problems with vandalism, with violence, because of this act. And it has made Lincoln Center become one of the kind of best known public places in New York City, even though it is a private institution. So it's a little bit of working with the content of where we're, the organization or client, but also we're pushing them to bring more public space into the program. So getting designs through the myriad of councils and regulating bodies is fairly tricky. And it does take a kind of talent and a lot of effort. For Lincoln Center, we had to start with the client, of course, and convince the client that the work we were doing was something that they would be behind. And that was the easy part, because they too were ambitious and wanted to remake the image of Lincoln Center. And we were hired because we had worked in the public realm, and they knew that we engaged the public in ways that architects don't generally do, through media, through what I would call cheeky, sort of funny engagements of the public that allow people to feel comfortable. And so they were on board quite early and easily. Although at Lincoln Center, for instance, we had to convince all 13 organizations that are part of the center to vote unanimously in favor of our work. So that in itself was a challenge. But on top of that, there were dozens of regulating bodies, historic preservation bodies, business bodies that regulate the area where Lincoln Center is, all of the city zoning and landmarks and all of that. And we had to make pitches to each and every one of those bodies over the course of several years to bring them all on board. And the first step, to answer your question in a short way, the first step is the client has to be in love with what you're doing, and you have to work on them first. And then when you finally go out into the world to seek approvals that are necessary to get things made, like a ULURP plan in New York, which requires, it's an amendment to the city charter, which changes the way urban development takes place. Once you have the client behind you, getting approvals by these agencies is much easier. And I'll talk a little bit about the High Line, because your questions have to do with New York. And you know, the High Line is a fantastic case in point about, to your question, that the privatization of public space, which it wasn't actually. It was the publicization of private space. And it's rare now, but it does happen. And it is a kind of model that a lot of cities are choosing to follow, because it shows that citizens, grassroots work, advocacy for public space can lead to a change in the belief system of how cities need to work today, which in general is that they're being privatized more and more, and that the public realm is false, because there's a false presentation that private space that's open to the public is public space, but it's not. It's not owned by the government. And this is also why all projects are political, particularly if you're doing them as public projects. They are, in the end, not mouthpieces for the government, but actually part of the government, you know, in the end. But for the High Line, it took two citizens that formed an organization, a coalition, to save the line in the first place, and then to convince the city to adopt the line as a public space, which happened. It helped that the people who formed Friends of the High Line knew people with money and that were very happy to support the project. That made the city much more happy to support the project. But in that case, not only did we give this railroad, which was a private property, an aggressive private property that cut through buildings and divided a neighborhood, we brought that into the public realm that is welcoming for everyone, and that instead of cutting through the city is actually about uniting the city. It's a platform for viewing the city differently, for engaging in the city, for thinking about the city, and thinking about your involvement in the city and your everyday life as a quotidian citizen. So it's difficult, but it can be done, and there are examples that are happening even in the States where new public space is being made that is truly public. And that part is really good news in all the gloom that we are, you know, in the midst of right now.